Hello, I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy number 15, and all of the Amazing Spider-Man annuals, which I say do not count. Although it's worth noting that I started picking up all these comics right when the David Michelinie run started, Dan. So, those issues count a little bit extra to me because that started my collection.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And during that era, Gil Kane came back on the book and did one of the annuals. So I mean, like a little bit of a notch there for that annual to have like a classic Spidey artist returning.
There you go.
And on that note, I am Dapper Dan Gavosden returning to this show. I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which includes that Gil Kane annual, which I say definitely count. But for me, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy.
Well, Dan, I'm sorry for your fantasies, but welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us for episode 4. And this is the actual episode 4, right, Dan? Not like that fake intro episode that you were counting as an
Fair
episode.
enough. Yeah. That's a zero number for those who use comic book numbering.
My goodness. Even in our own episodes, we just adopt the Marvel conventions. Well, this is episode 4 of season 7 of the Amazing Spider Talk, which, as we noted, focuses on David Michelinie and the surrounding era of his run.
Yeah, if you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show. Those reviews are important as they're our best way to spread the word about the show and indicate the size of our audience to guests and collaborators.
This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, including those from this season, exclusive artwork in the mail, and to help Dan and me keep this podcast going, go to amazingspidertalk.com and consider joining our Patreon.
Yeah, in this season of the Amazing Spider Talk, we're traveling back to the late 80s and early 90s to an era of Spider-Man's history that saw his comic completely visually reinvented, with sales reaching a peak that will likely never be replicated, and a whole host of creative voices that would go to change the comic industry forever. Yes, we're talking about the early half of writer David Michelinie's run on Amazing Spider-Man, where he worked alongside the early founders of Image Comics, Todd McFarlane and Erik Larsen. He married off Peter Parker and introduced the world to the hottest villain since the Ditko days, none other than Venom.
In this episode, we'll be specifically discussing the writing stylings and stories of David Michelinie during his unique pairings with Todd McFarlane and Erik Larsen. This will include discussions of how he wrote Peter Parker, the marriage to Mary Jane, the ongoing storylines that defined this half of the run, and then just an overall look at what made his contributions as a writer unique.
Yeah, so if you want to read along with us for our conversation, we're talking specifically about Amazing Spider-Man issues 298 to 350. Obviously, there's other stuff that he wrote in that time as well, but we're specifically looking at these Amazing Spider-Man issues with, I guess, a little bit of Alex Saviuk, but mostly Todd McFarlane and Erik Larsen on the pencils here. You can find these just about anywhere. They've been collected in Epic collections, trades about like Venom, a million times. They're available digitally everywhere where you can purchase comics or read them on the Marvel Unlimited app. And this one is one of the few kind of like gapless runs on that app. And you can find these issues pretty much anywhere. They sold really well, so there's a lot of them that made print, although they do tend to cost a little bit more given that you've got, the first introduction of Venom and his few first stories, and those Todd McFarlane covers and Erik Larsen covers tend to go for a little bit more. So if you are looking to pick them up in print, this can be kind of a bit of a costly run, if you so want to go that direction.
I have 2 copies of 300, Dan. So, if someone wants to talk to me about that and get themselves a copy, we can work something out, right?
Sure, right. You can bum a copy of 300 off of Mark, if you're so willing to trek it to Long Island. If you do want to hear our interview with David Michelinie, we got one of the last interviews with him before he stopped doing interviews. Which I don't know, maybe you can blame us for it. You can listen to our 2015 interview with him in the podcast feed. The episode's called Our Amazing Friend, David Michelinie. You can find that at amazingspidertalk.com, or I'll include a link in the show notes to it. It's a really good interview, one that I think Mark and I were really excited about because we both started reading comics with David Michelinie's work. And I think you'll get a lot of that kind of personal touch in that interview and find out more from David Michelinie himself rather than us just kind of speculating or talking about our feelings about his work. And so go check that out back in our podcast feed.
Awesome, Dan. Well, why don't we get right into it and start talking about the David Michelinie run?
All right, Mark, you are our trademark historian here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about David Michelinie's contribution to comics, before Spider-Man and what kind of got him into this kind of run with Amazing Spider-Man?
All right, sounds good. For those of you who lack visual aids, I am pushing my glasses up my nose right now and getting my historian hat on. Well, David Michelinie, he had been writing comics since the 1970s. He had started actually with DC, but for Marvel purposes, he basically made a name for himself, both at Marvel and really industry-wide with Iron Man. He had two separate runs writing Iron Man, first in the late 70s, early 80s, and then again in the mid-1980s. That first run that he did was probably some of his most famous stories, and frankly some of Iron Man's most famous stories, like Demon in a Bottle, which was about Tony's battle with alcoholism. He created characters like Justin Hammer, James Rhodes, Iron Suit variants. There was one of his issues, he had Tony was falling out of a helicarrier and he magically summoned his Iron Man costume to kind of wrap around him mid-air. So, these are all things that we have seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. These are David Michelinie's contributions, obviously. And then in his second run, he wrote Armor Wars, which is probably his most famous story there. And that, amongst other subplots, because the man likes subplots, as we're going to get into, he captured some physical friction between Tony and Captain America, kind of setting the stage for what would then really kind of come to a head during Civil War, and then that was captured in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So again, thank David Michelinie's Iron Man for a lot of the stuff you saw in the movies there. Separate from Iron Man, he also created Scott Lang's Ant-Man, which is obviously, that's the Ant-Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He also created Taskmaster. It's probably the most famous villain he created, not in Spider-Man. In terms of when he started to affiliate in the Spider office, he actually got his start. His first issue writing Spider-Man was ASM 205. He was filling in. He basically wrote a Marv Wolfman, he plotted a Marv Wolfman script, or he scripted a Marv Wolfman plot. Thank you. Sorry. And then he was eventually hired by Jim Owsley, aka Christopher Priest, to be the main writer for Web of Spider-Man in the mid-1980s. And, these stories were mainly focused on Peter Parker and the Bugle out on assignments. He got him in trouble with the IRA. I mean, what's not to like about that? And then he started writing ASM more regularly at 290 through 292. Then, of course, we had a little bit of an interlude with Kraven's Last Hunt, Life in the Mad Dog Ward. And then finally, 296, he had the two fill-in issues with Alex Saviuk. And then Todd McFarlane came in for 298. And he just kept on the book until about issue 388, I believe. I think it's Pursuit was the last story he did. At that point, it was Mark Bagley was doing pencils on that, which makes him the third longest tenured writer on Amazing Spider-Man. So he is right behind Stan Lee and Dan Slott. Dan Slott has written the most issues of Amazing Spider-Man, which is amazing to me. So David Michelinie, obviously, now we're not going to talk about the Mark Bagley part of his run in this episode. We're focusing on the McFarlane and Larsen issues, as we said in the intro. But it's one of the most prodigious runs in the book's history. But let's talk a little bit about what that actually means, because I think there's the numbers, and then it's what's behind the numbers, Dad. And I think
Sure.
what's behind the numbers is pretty interesting. So,
Well, I also think it's important to note something that he had in common with Dan Slott when doing this book is that there were several times during this book's publication that it was being released twice a month.
right.
Right. So like I mean, yes, a lot like all of the modern kind of creators like Dan Slott onward. And if you consider, Brand New Day, I mean, it's multiple different writers, but like, Michelinie also had periods where he was double shipping and the artists were double shipping too, which is frankly incredible.
Yeah.
Given like,
The kind of
how,
art we
like,
were getting.
yeah, and the amount of art. I mean, Larsen and McFarlane, they never took like a skip day. Like these
Yeah.
pages are packed.
Yep.
You might say overcrowded in some instances, but anyway, like that definitely helped bump up his number. Even if like the time it might not have like stretched as long as Stan Lee's contribution on the book, like the numbers certainly grew up for Michelinie because of the double shipping.
For sure. But and that frankly also, I mean, the double shipping spoke to the book's popularity. And we're going to obviously get into, well, what made the book so popular here? Was it all David Michelinie, or was it some of the other contributions? I think we're going to kind of land on the side of other contributions, but let's kind of start breaking it down a little bit. So Dan, let's first start with kind of our overall
Sure.
thoughts on this run, because it's like I said a few seconds ago, like I think for the most part, like in a vacuum, this run is very fondly regarded by fans. And like David came on our show, was a great guest. These were the first comics I read as a child.
I was going to ask, this is your first run. So are you able to kind of separate the nostalgia version of this, of you that loved these comics as a kid, and the you as an adult who is reading this with a more critical eye?
I mean, 100. I mean, look, I have, the separation happened a while ago for me. I mean, I think, in an endeavor I'm sure you're familiar with right now on your own end, Dan, when I was writing my book, I reread a lot of Spider-Man just to kind of refresh myself and learn the themes, and I think it was around then where and this was about a year or two after our interview with David Michelinie, conveniently enough, and I just remember thinking to myself, ooh, these are some pretty rough comics. But look, like, this is, I think, part of the reason why, I shouldn't even say part, I think the big reason why this run is so highly regarded is, first of all, you had basically, it's known for creating one of Spider-Man's greatest villains, not from the Silver Age, and frankly, probably one of comics' greatest villains from the last 30 years. I honestly cannot think, in terms of a big two villain, someone who's more significant post-Silver Age. I mean, maybe Thanos, but like that's the level we're talking about in terms of Venom. I mean, so like, we have a true phenomenon in terms of a villain created during this run, and that's obviously going to lend a very kind eye to it. The second part of it is, frankly, we had two legendary artists who worked on this book during that time. Todd McFarlane is now a name that transcends comics and has been for decades. And even putting aside like Image and the Image Revolution, which we're going to get to later in the season, like McFarlane he's a household name. Like, I mean, like he's one of those people, like I don't even know if people know he got his start in comics anymore, but they know who he is. You know what I mean? Like, that's how famous Tom McFarlane is. And Erik Larsen, I mean, I think he is more firmly in the camp of comic bookdom in terms of where his fame resides. But, he's one of the most famous comic book artists alive at this point, and has been for decades now. So you got that element to it. And then he was also the first writer to really handle the marriage, which, is more, I think in some ways is more popular than ever before. And,
Yeah.
and I think those three elements make this run so well loved. And it's was part of what made me love these comics. I mean, I've talked many, many times on this show before about like, I started reading around 296, 297. Within a couple of months, I had 300 and Venom and Todd McFarlane, and Mary Jane was in danger, but like also like I was just a little kid, but she's kind of wearing some scantily clad clothing, and I'm just like, ooh, what is going on in my life right now? This is a void being filled, and that's like that's look, like I think David Michelinie's got to get credit for being the shepherd and the glue and kind of a steady hand working with these artists. We'll discuss how I think he worked with some of these artists better than others in terms of the personalities. But like he definitely gets many points for that. But then when you start to drill down and actually look at the writing, the characterization, just some of the quirks of this run, you're just like, ooh, these are not like, if the art and Venom and the marriage weren't in them, I think we would probably be like kind of comparing this to like Denny O'Neil and Howard Mackey and that kind of stuff, like all great writers in their own right, but maybe not the right match for a long tenured run on Amazing Spider-Man.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things you say there. Although I'm going to make the sub headline to this episode, "The Sexual Awakening of Mark Ginocchio." Yeah, I agree with you. I think this run is very. I don't know if memeable is the right word, but I think like there are so many strong little elements in it that are very easily collected in other books. Like the Venom stories are all great. And that makes for a great trade collection. If you're one of those people that loves Mary Jane, you can screenshot the hell out of this run and sell you on those elements of it. There's a lot of like charm to be found within these pages. For a variety of things. If you love the art, boy, you could pull panels out of this. It's kind of how it works as a run in its entirety. That like I think is where you see stuff kind of falling apart, and I don't necessarily always blame Michelinie for that. I think he was handed a hot potato with the marriage and had to try to make it work. And I think a lot of what he does is admirable. Like I think he really gives it like the best try he could, but I think you can quickly realize that he doesn't quite know what to do with these characters. And in that regard, I'm glad you brought up Denny O'Neil and Marv Wolfman, because that is what this run reminds me of. If Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz reminded me of like Ditko and Lee or Romita and Lee, this reminds me of the 70s era, like late Jerry Conway, because it's kind of like not that it doesn't move the character forward, because there's a lot of changes for Peter and Mary Jane and his world within these pages, but it feels like it's kind of just inventing like troubles for them just because it has to fill the pages, rather than really kind of like exploring the world of these characters very fully. And so it feels kind of like it's treading water or running in place, and at a certain point it just keeps reusing the same stories over and over again. And there are changes. That might be too like hard of a thing to kind of label this with, but like there's a certain point where the same characters keep coming back and the same conflicts keep coming back. And it's kind of like it doesn't really have a broader hook to it. And I don't think that the characters are necessarily charming enough on the page to really keep you going. And very few of the villains outside of Venom really stick. There's a lot of like fill-in guys, and his history with Iron Man, I think, really shows here.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I have some other thoughts about it, but I know you want to talk about Iron Man.
Well, I do put a pin in that, Dan, because I want to touch on a couple other things that you had just talked about. First of all, the Venom, and look, we're spoiler alert, we're gonna do an entire episode about Venom this season, so I don't want to I don't want to use too many bullets, but I do want to add, like, in talking about Michelinie and his approach, and I can't even verify how much of this was his doing versus editorial or whatever. But I think one thing that really lifts this book up significantly was how Venom was used throughout the bulk of it. I don't know, you might disagree with this, Dan. I don't think we've ever actually had this conversation, but like, I feel the usage of Venom was nothing short of brilliant over the course of this run. I felt like they brought him in it was just like, just as you were maybe like, where's Venom? Venom would show up, but it was never like, I don't feel like it got totally overexposed at this point in the run. Every time he showed up, he was, was it Omega level threat or whatever the phraseology is?
Omega. Yeah.
Like just like, major threat, would torment Mary Jane or Aunt May. I mean, like, so, and it was just the right amount of usage. The artist clearly loved working with Venom. I mean, Larsen then kind of pushed him to the next level when he worked with him. They were probably among the only fun issues that Erik Larsen did with Michelinie, I feel like, were those Venom stories. And I
like the Punisher ones. Okay.
Yeah. Well, Punisher and Venom, you mean, right? I'm saying.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But it starts off just as a Punisher story.
Sure.
Yeah.
Fair enough. But like the point being is like again, like it lends to, I think, the nostalgia goggles that this run gets, because it's like, not only is it, not only did we create this great villain, but it was like, man, remember the days where like when Venom would show up and it felt like an event, and like it was just really cool and it wasn't overexposed, and he wasn't talking about eating brains constantly. So like, I think that lends a lot to it as well.
Well, on that note, I want to say, I think issue 317, the first return of Venom, is the peak of this run.
Yeah.
Throw in the Bagley issues too. Like, I don't think Michelinie's stuff ever got better than 317. And I think the same is true for Todd McFarlane, who drew that issue. I think it's the peak of his work as well. And might be a top 10 Spider-Man comic for me. I just think like that comic, like singularly, I mean, I know 300 is untouchable, and I know that's probably your favorite of the run.
Sure. But
like, to me, 317 was where it was like, oh, this is the iconic version of Venom, and what would make this character such a like phenom, and everything would be building off of like what that issue offers, which is a like ever present in the shadows threat to Peter, an unstoppable enemy that only can be defeated using psychological games. Like to me, that's the fullest exploration of like what made Venom awesome.
Yeah.
And in that, I think it's Michelinie's best issue too.
Yeah, for sure. So just to go back to your question about like the Tony Stark and Iron Man of it all, I think, and again, I mean, I have very specific examples of the analogs here, but like, I think it's important to note that I think a lot of the, beyond just this familiarity with the characters in the universe with Iron Man, I think a big part of why David Michelinie used this world so much was because you could just tell it was where he was comfortable as a writer, and he even like indicates this as much in his interview with us. Like, so he was kind of a darker satirical writer. He clearly had issues with like the system, especially when it comes to like wealth and the rich and the billionaires and the millionaires of the world, like a lot of distrust for like the power system of the world, which these are all, I think, themes that tie in a lot in an Iron Man universe. I don't know if they work as well in a Spider-Man universe, but like he went with it anyway.
Can I add on to that? I think it's interesting that like that was a focus of his too in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
Like this is like the like greed is good Gordon Gekko era. And like throughout this book, there's like tons of references to like cocaine use and things like that. It's actually like a big part of like the Sinister Six plot that he eventually gets to, that like Dr. Octopus is using people's use of cocaine to like destroy the world and specifically the rich. And so like it does in that way feel very late 80s to me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to
And
say, remember, Dan, despite what our parents say, not everyone loved Ronald Reagan's presidency. And there's clearly some pushback here, I think, from Michelinie in terms of the kinds of stories he wrote.
yeah, I mean, even like the introduction of like Cardiac eventually,
Yeah.
who is like a guy that's trying to like make up for the privatized healthcare system.
Yes.
But like he might as well be a stand-in for like Bernie Bros.
Right.
So like, which is to say me believing in universal healthcare. But like it is interesting how much of that kind of political stuff does find its way into the pages here, and how much it truly does go after the whole sort of greed is good, rich Ronald Reagan era. It doesn't go quite as far as like the Dark Knight Returns, but like it's in that realm.
Yes.
And it is weird for Spider-Man to be in that realm. And maybe it's weird how he handled it, but it is interesting how many of the villains are just like dudes in suits.
Yeah, it's dudes in suits. He like Michelinie. I mean, he even said as much in our interview. He loves what he would refer to as secondary villains. He loves the hired goons or the henchmen. He doesn't, like his whole conceit for Taskmaster was, I wanted to create the guy who trained the other guys. You know what I mean? Like that was his whole conceit. So like that's why we had guys like Chance and Solo and Paladin or Paladin. However, I'm going to get corrected by the internet on that, I'm sure. Like Silver Sable, who was obviously not one of his creations, but like again, kind of like like he loved Michelinie loved his shades of gray in terms of and then this all ties into what we were just talking about. Like it's an Iron Man thing, but it's an anti-establishment, anti-Reaganism take, I think is a big part of it. And I kind of, when you talk about the run, yes, I agree with you where in terms of where it peaked with that Venom story. I think a lot of people, I think not that this is the peak in terms of the best story, but I kind of feel like in terms of like where this was, because he didn't really tell a lot of long range stories. I mean, there was like tons of subplots upon subplots, and we had this Jonathan Caesar storyline, which we'll get into when we talk a little bit about the marriage and stuff, and the Webb's tour and all these other like kind of like ongoing storylines. But he really didn't have, outside of the few Venom stories, like big arcs. But the big arc that kind of was like the culmination, at least with his run with McFarlane, was Assassination Plot, which are 6 beautiful looking issues, I think, in terms of like certainly like the covers and the interior art and stuff like that. But the story, like it, not even that it doesn't make sense, but like, how is this a Spider-Man story? It's about like, there's a plot against the king of Symkaria, and he gets murdered. So Spider-Man teams up with Silver Sable and Captain America, and they question Spider-Man's patriotism. And there's a freaking issue with him draped in a flag, and I'm just like, what is happening here?
And Sabretooth shows up and murders people.
Like, and it's all about preventing a war between Symkaria and the United States. And it's like, this is an Iron Man story, like cosplaying as a Spider-Man story, and it has no place in this universe. And that's
on top of that, I want to add, like, you mentioned the Webb's tour, but like a lot of this book is international too, which was a hallmark of like Iron Man. And maybe you could tie it back into the sort of like creeping like nation building and expansionism and nationalism of like the Reagan era. And maybe there's a critique there of like, are you truly an American? If you're not behind us, slowly working our way east through Europe or whatever. The international thing is also very weird. And in some ways this run, rereading it now, having read Worldwide, the volume 4 stuff, this does feel like a weird trial run for what we would get in like Slott's Worldwide stuff, taking like Peter Parker and Spider-Man into kind of like international territory and having them deal with like, Zodiac and like other kind of like figures that would not really be a part of the Spider-Man Rogues Gallery.
Yeah. Although like even that I felt was a little bit more foundationed in the
Sure.
anchored in the Spider-Man universe. But like, no, I think it's a really good analogy, Dan. Something that like upon reviewing this run again for this episode, the phrase that came into my mind, which kind of cracks me up, is it's like, this is the amazing pedantic Spider-Man. You know what I mean? There is just an element of literalness that comes in this story that I'm just like, look, man, like we're Dan, you and I, we're we have our quirks, so I don't, I'm not casting any kind of aspersions on anyone, but like, we're Michelinie's really in the weeds on this book.
Yeah.
Like it's again, it ties into the larger his larger trends as a writer. I think it's like it's that Taskmaster proposition on steroids, which is like, okay, I need to find an explanation for everything, because otherwise I don't know how I can tell this story unless I'm really justifying, well, how can Peter really support himself being a photographer? Well, no, he can't. And he's got to find this new apartment for him and MJ. So now he's gonna sell a book, which, like, look, I like Webbs is charming in its own right, but like, I don't know, like there's something about like Peter Parker like selling a coffee table book that just seems so absurd to me. I don't know, like, am I is that just a me thing, or do you actually
I think there's something interesting there, like, because one, he doesn't create it, right? Like, he is kind of like, it's created by Jonah, who's looking to make money
Sure.
off of Peter Parker's work, but they let him go on the tour and make money for doing signings, which like is cool. And I think there's like a fun interplay between like him being like, hey, this is my chance to finally like be famous. And he starts to resent Spider-Man for like showing up or having to show up at these things and take on the spotlight away from Peter, which is kind of funny to see him playing against himself and also like MJ's fame. So I think there's something interesting there to do with like, how does Peter still feel? And this is another dated thing, is the sort of like, how does Peter feel like not being the breadwinner in the relationship with MJ? And this is like his way of maybe trying to step up and be like, no, I can still bring home the bacon. I can still, be the man of the house. And having it kind of be a little bit of a joke on his behalf. Also, Webbs is fun because it gets to make fun of like what it means to be an author of a book. And I think Michelinie is like making fun of himself and how little celebrity that like authors actually have. So I like that about it, but it is silly, and it is silly to think like that Webbs would be some international thing that would send Peter all the way to Ohio to, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the pedantic, like, I think the best encapsulation of it is like there's an issue of the comic with Erik Larsen that he wrote where Peter goes to a scientist to have his like body scanned to basically find out how all of his spider powers work.
Yeah.
And it ends up robbing him of his spider powers for a brief period of time. But it's like, in many ways, I admire it because I feel like that, like if Ditko stayed on the book longer, we probably would have gotten to that point.
Sure.
Where it's like, let's really break down the sort of mechanics of how this all works. But like, I don't know that many other writers would be like, let's truly figure out like why he's sticking to the wall and like what are, not that Michelinie gives the definitive answer on those things, but it shows a tendency, I think, that you're highlighting in terms of the storytelling. And the other kind of trend, and what really helped me see this, is reading the recent stories by David Michelinie that they've brought him back for recently, for like the Venom,
the Lethal Protector. Yeah.
And like separation anxiety, is that like, and you mentioned it with like Assassination, is that like a lot of times his stories have all of this, not just subplots, but like they bring in the grander Marvel universe in ways that I don't think are entirely necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, Assassination does this a lot. It's like, oh, someone killed the president. It's not just someone, it's Sabretooth.
Yeah.
And here comes Captain America. And here comes blah, 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 blah. And like so many of these stories have these sort of elements in them where it's like just some like whole other story that doesn't really need to be there, that bloats the comic a little bit. And sometimes you get something really memorable out of it, but oftentimes it like just feels like a little bit like, an editor could have probably helped him like combine 3 characters into 1 character, or something like that.
Yeah. Cause for sure. I mean, like, and I feel like he also just he loved himself a good conspiracy. We talked about this a few minutes ago in terms of like the greed is good kind of thing. But like also it was like these corporations were often, and we still get this, like, it's not like this is resigned just to Michelinie, we have Beyond now. But it's like, like these corporations, you have like the Life Foundation, which is like this criminal organization. And it turns out that like they're creating more symbiotes and doing that. And like, even like, we'll talk about this with the Hines brothers in a few weeks, but like, Sticks and Stone, what like their whole origin story was there was a doctor, basically, an evil doctor who started creating experiments on homeless people. And it's like, it's all these like kind of cockamamie conspiracies about like, well, what if the rich people did this, or what if a fancy doctor did this, like
you mentioned the Life Foundation. Before they were into symbiotes, their whole thing was like, rich people need a place to live after the apocalypse.
Right?
Can we build them a place to live forever? Which weirdly has gained resonance in the past 10 years.
Sure.
As our tech bros are seeking to do the same. But that led them to symbiotes. And you kind of get like a proto version of like the symbiotes here, where we meet like these like deformed like man creatures that can like shapeshift their bodies to guard these underground habitats. But anyway, I'm spinning off, but it is like all these things are like conspiracies involving rich people.
Yes. And then, just a couple of other like very easy line to draws in terms of Michelinie, writing what he knew. I mean, early in the run, we see Taskmaster, obviously his creation. Whiplash, he's an Iron Man villain. Justin Hammer, both an Iron Man villain and a Michelinie creation. He also used, I mean, frankly, a lot of the villains he created in Web of showed up here, like what's his face? Chance is a Web of creation.
Yeah.
Solo is a Web of creation. I know that this became very on trend in the 90s in comic books, but like, lots of Kylar and shoulder pads and pouches and it was very tactical. It was in addition to being pedantic, it's a very tactical version of Spider-Man. Like, it's funny. Like we hear this phrase a lot when we talk about new runs of Spider-Man. We're gonna ground Spider-Man, but this is grounded Spider-Man, but it's not street level Spider-Man, which I think is a big distinction from, say, like what Jerry Conway did with, trying to relive the days of the Crime Master and, Freddie Foswell and stuff like that.
Before spinning off to Hammerhead's Ghost.
Yeah,
the less said about that, the better.
Come on, let's show some respect to Jerry Conway. But Jerry Conway was doing his old hand in Spectacular at this point, which I think you can even see is a big distinction from what this is. This is more about tech and money and wealth and conspiracies and politics and fascism and these are all phrases that sound cool on paper, but like put them all into like a bucket and then shake them up and make a Spider-Man story of it. I don't know if it always works.
Yeah, it's funny. Like you said fascism, but like there's a lot of like Nazi stuff going on in this run, and like it's funny, he even brings like the Red Skull back and doesn't even tie it into Peter's parents at all.
Right.
Like it's like he forgot that storyline or ignored it in some way, and it's like, oh, here's a Red Skull Spider-Man story that has nothing to do with the Parkers. So like, that just shows you kind of like the penchant for like what he was interested in exploring on this book. Yeah. Well, as a writer, like other than the themes and ideas that he's getting into, like how do you find his kind of writing style? Like, he's a wordy guy. He can be funny, like, and clearly in some of these stories, he really pulls off some threatening menace with Venom. Like, you got hooked on this. Like, what do you think it was as a kid or even as an adult that you find in Michelinie's writing?
I mean, I guess I, I think before it became kind of played out, I think as a writer, I think the fact that he didn't easily cast people as good or bad was
Yeah.
appealing to me. Because I think that's authentic. Like, sometimes you gotta have an uneasy alliance with people, like Spider-Man and Silver Sable, like very frequently during this run. And we talked last season about what I think about Silver Sable, Dan. So and this run didn't like make me, I didn't turn on this run after the fact because of Silver Sable. Like I was like, I think even back as a kid, I was like, what's this character doing again?
She fits in with this run. I'll say that
For sure.
She is like this. She feels more at home here than she did in the Friends DeFalco era.
Yeah. I mean, look, like I was 8, 9 years old here when I read this run for the first time. I mean, what drew me to the run? It goes back to the very first thing I started talking about. I mean, it was the art, it was the character, it was the villains, specifically Venom, and it was the marriage. And like the writing, like I don't even know if I really, outside of the Venom stories, remembered the stories from my childhood. I think it was one of the, because like, you know, yeah, like you said, they're wordy and kind of dense and over explainy. Going back to the pedanticness, everything needs like an explanation, and I'm just like, you just keep, it's comics, I'm kind of just like, how did Norman Osborn get a bomb in Aunt May's brain? It's comics. I don't need to know. You know what I mean?
Maybe that one could have used more explanation.
I mean,
but
maybe,
fair enough.
but like that's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, could you imagine David Michelinie doing that story? I mean, it would just be like, oh my god, we're in part 3 of him explaining how the bomb works. What are we doing here? So anyway, but like the fact is, like, the writing itself on its own merits was not what drew me into this book. It was all these other things. But like the other things really worked, and I think the writing was I don't want to say even good enough, but like it was there enough to just pass. But like why, like you said, why is Sabretooth involved in killing Symkarian presidents? I don't know, but look, it's Sabretooth, and he's got really cool claws because McFarlane's drawing him. You know what I mean? Like, let's be real here. That's the draw of this book.
Well, at the heart of any Spider-Man comic is Peter Parker. Like, I think his Peter is distinct.
Yes.
But to me, it doesn't really read as Peter Parker's voice all the time in here. He's kind of this like lovable oaf. He's kind of charming and he can be funny, but he's not quite as like depressive, I think, as a normal Peter. He's not quite as down on his luck.
Right.
And there is some jealousy and anger elements from him here, but like I just don't know that he quite stands out as a character as much as I'm used to, beyond him being kind of like the sort of like insert protagonist here character.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think it was, frankly, it's reflective of the fact, and we'll talk more specifically about this in a few minutes, but it's reflective of the fact that he's married now. You know what I mean? Like, you can't really write, a depressive kind of, emotionally up and down character when you have a wife now. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, you could try, and I think he does try to show some depth with him vis-a-vis MJ, but I think at the end of the day, it we Donovan and I talked about this. I think, the marriage inherently changed who Peter was as a character, and some people think that change was fantastic. Other people are like, oh, yeah, you kind of took away a core part of the character now by doing this, because like you said, like how do you reconcile that? Like you can't have depressed mopey Peter when he's married to this hot supermodel and selling a book around the world. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't add up. And I think it took a little bit of a core part of his thing around. Instead it became more about protecting MJ and making sure that again, his secrets of Spider-Man didn't harm her. He still doesn't really kind of know what he wants to do with his life. He's accruing more college loans, which I just don't like. How many times is he going to go back to college in this book? I don't know.
Thank God this was in the era that the college was relatively inexpensive, because today Peter would be, the sliding timeline is like helping him accrue so much debt, Mark. Every year that goes by, his college years are closer, and college cost him more money.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think it's interesting you said lovable oaf, because like in addition to, like not being as kind of down on his luck as he was just because of the marriage, I also think like that's reflective of McFarlane's art. Like McFarlane definitely makes him beefcake. And he's not, like this whole, the famous scene during the Stern JR issues when he's in the muscle tank, and what does he say, party animal or whatever on the
animal, yeah.
I think like that's this whole run is
Yes.
is Peter in an animal muscle tank. So
yeah, he is kind. I don't know. I think broy is probably the wrong.
Yeah, he's not a
adjective
bro,
to use,
but he's bro adjacent.
Yeah, it's more on that spectrum than we're used to Peter kind of being the kind of like dorky, nervous, so to speak. Like this is not the guy that puts on the Spider-Man suit and makes jokes out of like fear. Like that's just not present really in this run in quite the same way. And like you said, he like cycles through all these jobs, and a lot of it is motivated by him trying to live up to like MJ's presence in his life. And he eventually like decides to like go back to school, where he's working for this character we've never really seen again, Professor Evan Swan, who like starts off as Dr. Swan. But apparently like at Empire State, he faked his credentials, including his high school diploma. Like right when we meet him, they find this out. And yet they still let him keep working in the labs at the university. Quite a thing.
Yeah.
Quite a thing.
Makes sense.
The late 80s and early 90s.
Right.
But anyway, I mean, like the one other constant in this run is like the status quo keeps changing on like what's going on with like Peter, like, and where he's living and all that stuff. And so let's talk about the marriage, because this is the first time we're seeing the marriage over. I mean, obviously it's the first run with it after Jim Shooter wrote, the annual.
Right.
And I want to commend Michelinie for his writing of the marriage, not because I think it works, but because I think he really gave it like a try. Especially for someone who didn't really want it to happen.
For sure. I think that's an important thing to get out in the open here. And he says it in our interview, he says it in other interviews. David Michelinie did not want to write a married Peter Parker. Like, I think there was definitely a part of him that was like, oh, wait, I get to do Spider-Man. Great. Oh, I have to do that. And apparently, like, he pitched something for the wedding issue where I think he was trying to, like, more or less avoid having the marriage actually happen. And, like, Shooter was like, no, like, we're doing the freaking marriage. I'm just going to write it then.
Yeah, because like there's a version of this where like Mary Jane is kind of just always in the background, but he like takes that mantra and goes, "Let me make her the co-star of the book."
Yeah,
right. And without her being a superhero, like he still commits himself to the idea of like, I am going to give her like a not co-equal subplot, but like I'm going to give her major things to do in the book, throughout the book's time on the run. And it kind of like and we'll get into the specifics, but my overall take is like, I want to really commend him for doing that.
Yeah.
And he also gives her subplots that aren't related to Peter and Spider-Man,
Sure.
as if she has her own life. But there's something even in the realm of comics where like Spider-Man repeatedly fighting villains doesn't feel absurd, but a civilian repeatedly fighting back against like threats in her own life feels absurd and like kind of like dangerous and gross in some instances that like you can get away with supervillains being evil, but like putting MJ through this level of trauma as a normal person feels really weird. And I think maybe if like JMS was the first person to ever write The Marriage, we would all be saying like how well The Marriage works and is an essential part of Spider-Man. Although I feel like most people say that. But like, I think just reading the Michelinie run with any kind of critical analysis, and you can see just how much he's struggling to make it work, even if he's giving it the best he could. And there's a lot I like about it, but it just by the end, even by the end of Larsen, we're not even at the end of his run, you can tell he's running out of ideas on how to continue making this work.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that Michelinie had talked about over the years was like he didn't want to write MJ as a damsel in distress. And like in terms of like, you know, the Superman trope of like, you know, Spider-Man always, you know, showing up like he's Superman with Lois Lane to save the day. He didn't do that. You know, like that's not what this book is. So like,
yeah.
So mission accomplished. But like you said, he introduces drama and threats to MJ in a different way. And like you know, the 800-pound gorilla we're talking about here is the Jonathan Caesar subplot, which is just this weird, creepy, rapey subplot that happens in this book with this guy who is obsessed with MJ and you know tries to, you know, basically you know, he wants her romantically, and then starts to mess.
He has a shrine to her built in his room,
Yeah.
And he kidnaps her with like goons guarding the door and tries to physically have his way with her and force her to marry him,
Right.
Where he will keep her locked in his apartment and, you know, yada, yada, yada. The implications there are like, don't need to be spelled out.
Sure.
And it's immediately like, okay, yes, a villain, sure, but I don't know how much I want to keep reading a book where like my co-lead female character is under this kind of rapey threat from this guy.
Yeah, and look, it's not, you know, to Michelinie's, I don't want to say credit necessarily, but like this isn't, you know, well, Doc Ock is kidnapping her and holding her hostage on top of the Empire State Building, and Spider-Man has to save her. With that said, like, you know, Michelinie was kind of like in the book of interviews that Tom DeFalco did. He was like, yeah, I guess I caught some heat for that Caesar story. I don't know, I guess, you know, good intentions and all. And it was like, yeah, no kidding. Like even, you know, like think about how far we've come in terms of how we tell stories and stuff now, Dan. Like, you know, we could talk, you know, we could say, you know, oh, a story like that would never be told in comics today, and it wouldn't. But like even back in the late 1980s, people were like, "What is this? Like this is going a little too far in terms of like the, you know, like, yeah, it's not a traditional damsel in distress situation, but it's a lot darker or more twisted. And you know, I don't know if this is how you want to manifest the marriage between MJ and Peter either. You know what I mean? Like this is not, you know, like sure he's giving MJ agency, but like to what end?
Yeah, I mean, she fights off Jonathan Caesar, right? And like good for her.
Yeah.
You know, and like and there's points in the book where they specifically go out of her way to be like, hey, Spider-Man has nothing to do with this. Like, leave him out of it. This is between you and me, MJ and Jonathan Caesar. But like the longer it goes on, it starts off as this very real, creepy thing. And like before you know it, like not only is like he trying to kidnap her from jail, he is like destroying their lives. He basically bankrupts, you know, Peter and MJ by like causing her to lose work in the modeling realm, which then forces her to go and work on Secret Hospital and start her acting career. And then there's a number of like also creepy things there with her, like the director like that is like treating her poorly, and like a co-actor that is kissing her in a way that like is maybe inappropriate. And then there's like this whole running subplot of like near fatal accidents that are happening to Peter and MJ, but end up fatally hurting someone around them. Like on the set of Secret Hospital, someone is killed when a light crashes on them. There's a scene where like an old woman confronts MJ on the street, recognizing her from Secret Hospital, and slaps her across the face. And MJ's like, that must mean I'm a good actress because she hates the character I play. And then the woman gets run over by a car in the street. And it turns out that like, we suspect it's Jonathan Caesar the whole time, but no, it's not Jonathan Caesar. It's MJ's other obsessive fan who kills Jonathan Caesar and tries to get at Mary Jane. And at that point, it's like a weird Looney Tunes cartoon, but like underneath it all is like even more rapey men who are murdering each other to get at MJ and killing innocent bystanders. And it's like, what is this? Like, we have so like lost the thread here. And like, you can just like, that's the point where I'm like, he has no idea what to do with MJ as a character and how to keep her an essential part of this book. Because it's just so absurd. Yeah. Anyway, that's my whole spiel about the Jonathan Caesar plot line.
What did you think of how Felicia Hardy is integrated into this with, vis-a-vis the marriage? Did you like that little subplot in there?
I mean, it's also kind of absurd, and I guess it really depends on like what Felicia Hardy we're talking about. Like, I think the Felicia Hardy that we're reading here is not necessarily the one that we saw developed through Spectacular Spider-Man and other more recent Amazing Spider-Man books. This is the Felicia Hardy from her first appearance, where she's kind of truly obsessed with Spider-Man. Because like she shows up and she's been away and she's got this whole new look. And like, I don't think McFarlane, for as great of an artist as and great at redefining characters he was, I don't think he ever figured out how to draw Felicia.
Yeah.
She looks kind of like Storm. It's weird. It's like this very punk aesthetic. But she's like, doesn't know that Peter got married, which just speaks to, I guess, like the speed of the marriage. And she's back to reclaim him as her own. And so instead, when she finally finds out, she's going to get Peter jealous by dating Flash Thompson, and like injecting herself into his life. And at this point, I feel like Felicia had evolved past that characterization.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm looking at it with like 2020 hindsight or whatever, but like I think Felicia wasn't that character anymore.
Poor dumb Flash. I mean, I will say like the reveal, because I think, she first finds out that he's married in one of the Venom issues, because Venom, like, she goes to show up at the house and Venom is there and like, brutally assaults her. And it is, I mean, it's a hard scene to read, like in terms of things that we probably wouldn't see depicted that way anymore. With that said, like I always, I don't want to say liked, but like I thought I was intrigued by the fact that like, in the midst of like this like brutal assault, and she's like, her face has been smashed up and everything, Venom walks away saying, I was waiting for the wife or something like that, and she's just like marry, or like that's how she finds out. And like, despite the fact that her body looks like it's been in absolute carnage, not that carnage,
not yet,
not yet. She's very much like, wait, he's married, you know what I mean? And I was always like, oh, that was a cool twist to me. But then everything that followed, it was just like, wait, what are you doing? And yeah, I agree with you in terms of the character design too. It was not the Todd father's best work, in my opinion.
I do like how Michelinie incorporated Aunt May more into the book, and having like Peter and MJ move in with her, and like the subplot of Peter like trying to be like, like, I'm trying to be a man now. I'm married. I can't go move back in with my aunt. Like, I'm going to feel infantilized. And I think that's a really kind of like honest portrayal of like someone trying to kind of advance in their life, but ultimately he feels like there's too much tragedy surrounding Aunt May and that she could really use him. And I tend to like when the Parkers are living with Aunt May. I think there's a kind of like cool family vibe there. And I think the relationship between Aunt May and MJ has always been an interesting one because it's fairly supportive. And so I like the establishment of that here. And he does tie up the Nathan Lubensky like plot line, and by tie up I mean
Kill him,
have him killed. So which I think was probably the character's fate from the get-go. Like, I don't know how many people really needed him, and Aunt May seems to move on very quickly. Like, within a couple issues she's like dating the mailman. So I don't know how much this book truly missed having him on board.
Oh, poor Nathan. Do we want to talk a little bit about the book transitioning to Erik Larsen?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it does feel like there are some subplots that continue in here, but to me, this is where everything kind of starts. Like, there's new stuff, but a lot of it starts repeating, or stalling out a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, look, again, in terms of background, Michelinie, when we've talked to him and in other interviews, he only has the nicest things to say about Todd McFarlane, which, not that I necessarily expect him not to be nice about Todd McFarlane, because I'm sure Todd McFarlane made David Michelinie quite a lot of money back in the heyday. I mean, with that said, like, he seemed like, I think he's sincere in that he legitimately liked working with Todd. And Erik Larsen, on the other hand, these two did not get along. I think, Larsen has been very open and candid about the fact that he feels that Michelinie took too much credit for creations like Venom and things like, like he's like, very much of the ilk of Ditko and Kirby in terms of, the artists' contributions to comics versus, the writers. Larsen was very much in that, but like, I think Larsen, what crossed the line with Michelinie was more that Larsen kind of would speak on behalf of McFarlane as well. And, McFarlane, from what I've read, has never like disputed anything that Larsen has said on his behalf, but like, McFarlane has never said those things in dispute necessarily. Like McFarlane at this point, he left the book to do adjectiveless Spider-Man because, in his words, I was tired of drawing other people's plots. Which, kind of sounds like, something a famous, but maybe, not intellectually deep artist would say at that phase of his career. You know what I mean? Like I'm just going to do it all myself and write Doom 950 times. But we'll get to that in a later episode this season. Larsen, though, was just like Larsen is very much like I am, behold my field of FUCKs and it is barren. Like just this whole thing. And I think as a result, like, Michelinie did not like working with him. Larsen did not like working with him. And the book shows like, yes, there are threads that kind of continue, but like, we definitely feel like at this point we're just kind of moving from story to story. It's like, oh, here's the return. Like, they got the return of the Sinister Six. I'm trying to remember what episode it was where I was like, is the Sinister Six really that cool? Because we really got 30 something years between appearances. But I
think it was our Ultimate Spider-Man review that you went off on the Sinister Six.
Okay. I know it got brought up in the Slack. They're like, yeah, Mark was right. I'm like, yeah, that's right. I'm right. Damn right. But like, seriously, we got the return of the Sinister Six, and yet it's like such a, like, I don't know, like a hollow story to me. Like, outside of Cosmic Spider-Man, which I legitimately like that story, although it technically started with McFarlane, is there any of these Larsen stories that you kind of hold in high regard that also don't include Venom?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I like the Punisher storyline that eventually includes Venom. And like, I think the vibes overall on this part of the run are like fun. And a lot of that I think is like Larsen brings a lot of energy to his pencils and stuff like that. And like, you can go back and listen to my, our interview with Erik Larsen on the show. And like, those comics were a great deal of fun to revisit. But if we're just looking at it for like Michelinie's contributions to the comics, like, no, there's not really any that really scream out to me, or live in my memory that don't involve Venom. But again, the Venom stories that are in here are a great deal of fun.
They're a great deal of fun, but they also repeat beats. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like that's, I mean, I love that Venom Island story. Like that's a story that was very formative for me growing up, and yet it's not necessarily beat for beat a repeat of the
317,
317, but it's similar. You know what I mean? Like it's we're going over a lot of the same ground there.
Yeah, and the Venom fighting like Sticks and Stone in Central Park is not that interesting of a story.
No.
And that may be more to like Sticks and Stone being not particularly interesting villains. A guy that just wants to touch you is kind of weird and creepy.
Yeah.
I guess, and his fingers, especially drawn by Larsen,
right,
are crazy long. But we'll talk about Larsen's art and stuff later in the season. Yeah, no, I mean, I like the cosmic stories too. I mean, the Sinister Six story is like another example of like why Sinister Six typically doesn't work, which is like they eventually boil down to not really being about a team of villains. It's really just, in this case, it all just becomes a Dr. Octopus storyline,
right,
with a bunch of other guys on the side. And in many ways, kind of like rereading it this past week, I was like, oh, this is very like Ends of the Earth adjacent. And not just because they're trying to fry the world with a satellite, but yeah, it's not particularly memorable, other than for like the art being pushed into like almost like a manga like realm that we had never really seen Spider-Man go before or be that abstracted. And so that's interesting, but like still save that for another episode of the show. Yeah.
I will just add, the big contribution with Michelinie and Larsen as it relates to Doc Ock is white suit Doc Ock. So there you go. I mean, for all you collectors and whatnot. Is there anything else about this run that you wanted to?
I feel like we've really been kind of like dumping on this run, which is to say, like, I read this when I was probably about the same age as you, although I was coming to it after it had been released rather than while it was released. And I loved this as a kid, and like, I don't know how much I like I said, the story stuck with me more than it was like turning the pages and thinking it was cool or like thinking that the covers rocked, across this. But, like, this did have a really special place for me in my early days of collecting. And, maybe it was right time, right place. And revisiting it is maybe a like sort of a folly, in that like it really spoke to what was cool in the 90s.
Sure.
And it doesn't quite hold up the same. But I think I would probably issue the same criticism if I was like my age now and reading this in the 90s too.
Yeah. I mean, it's just it's so weird and kind of dissident, but the fact is this is an iconic run of Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Like, this is like, not even just because of its longevity, but like, like a lot of stuff happens here that is, I think, famous to what makes the character the character. With that said, David Michelinie is a writer. So if you're looking strictly at the writing on its merits and how it fits into the Spider-Man universe and what we know about it and what we prefer, frankly, I mean, because that's ultimately what this show is about. It's lacking something, and that's, and that's why it sounds like we're dumping on it. But like, yeah, like you can't talk about this run without really just being fully transparent about the fact that this is it's probably the most famous Spider-Man as a comic book has ever been during this. I mean, outside of maybe the 60s, but like, I don't even know if it had that level of cachet at this point. You know what I
Well,
mean?
even when you look back at like the best runs of comics or superhero comics, you don't see people bring this up unless they're specifically isolating the Venom comics from it.
Right.
Right. Like people will say, go pick up 300, 317, the Return Venom Island, and when you see collections of this, they're typically collected as like, I had the old one with the Bagley cover with Venom's face morphing on Eddie Brock,
Yep.
and it was the Spider-Man Venom collection, right?
Yep.
Like that is how you see these comics like kind of resold. And I think for years I overrated my love of this run, because when I would go back and revisit it, I would just revisit the Venom issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And like those Venom issues have probably been read more than probably almost any other Spider-Man comic, not Amazing Fantasy 15. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure people have probably read that more than most of the Ditko issues.
I mean, as a kid, I had that Greatest Collection of Spider-Man trade, and it had 317 in it, and boy, did I read that comic a million times. My favorite like page in that whole book was that opening page of Peter's hands like recoiling and Eddie standing there on the porch, like asking to see Parker, like that stuff is great, but save that for our Todd Father episode, because I think that's the thing that really stood out to me.
Yeah. I mean, the one last thing I'll say about this, Dan, is, kind of to this whole point was, I've talked about this both in the Substack and on my blog and stuff like that, the infamous, the comics that were stolen from me by my cousin many years ago. It's worth noting, so guys, like, my story with Amazing Spider-Man 300 is very complicated because I had it as a kid. It when I was in my teens and realized it was actually worth something, I couldn't find it, so I had to go back and buy it a second time. And I paid a decent amount, but not as much as it's worth today. And then a couple of years ago, I got a call from my cousin saying that he had something of mine that he needed to get back to me, and he felt really guilty about it. I had no idea what he was talking about, and he had a stack of comics that he had taken from my parents' house, but on the top of the pile was a 300 and a 317. And he said as much to me. He was like, I took these from you because they had Venom in it, and I knew he was cool. And my cousin's not a comic book collector, but like again, like we're talking about like the impact of this character and these creations and this run, and like I had other comics certainly from that era, and he gravitated towards the Venom issues because like it was so much more than that. It transcended just standard comics, and I don't think we're ever going to see, we hem and haw about Amazing Spider-Man now and what it means and why can't he do this and why can't he do that, and the fact of the matter is, I think in our minds, we're thinking that this is 1988, 1989, when Amazing Spider-Man was the most famous version of Spider-Man that you will ever see, that you will ever have in your lifetimes. And we're past that. Like, the comics aren't that anymore. And I think you have to kind of acknowledge the greatness, and part of that greatness was David Michelinie's contributions to it. Whether the writing at its core was as refined and elegant as we would have wanted it to be, it doesn't matter, because like he was the shepherd of the most famous era of Spider-Man comics. I don't know how else to put it, so like you said, we might be dumping on it, but at the end of the day, like, you have to have reverence for it, because when we will never see this again in my mind in a Spider-Man comic.
Yeah, probably not. While you're telling a collecting story, I'll tell you my collecting story about this run. Because those Todd McFarlane covers tend to go for extra money. That, when I was beginning my teaching career, I didn't have much of, but I was still collecting nevertheless. And so like the shop I would go to, Twilight Zone Comics, which still exists, although it's owned by a different person now. He Bumper, who was my comic guy there and owned the shop, would do these sales. And I think it was Free Comic Book Day. I went and he had a big sale on back issues, and everything in the middle of the store, $2 an issue. And so I go and I start digging through, and boom, there is a long box full of the Todd McFarlane, David Michelinie run. And I'm like, this can't be right.
Yeah, right.
So I start kind of going through it, and like, there's other $2 comics in that box. So I went to Bumper and I said, hey, I don't, want to pull all these out if this isn't part of the sale. And I also don't want to rip you off. And he was like, well, and this speaks to his quality as a comic book guy. He said, well, they shouldn't have been in that box, but if they're there and if it says $2, they're all $2. And so I bought the entire, I think pretty much other than maybe 300, I think I bought the entire Todd McFarlane, David Michelinie run of Amazing Spider-Man comics for $2 a pop.
Well done.
And that one of the greater finds in my collection there. So I don't think that's something you're likely to see happen today.
And no one stole them from you, right?
No. I to this day have not met your cousin.
No. He was very sorry. I don't think he listens, but if he knew I was talking about it, he would probably text me like, "Why are you making me sound like a bad person? I was just a kid." It's like, it's okay.
I mean, end of the day, he probably saved that comic. Like, young Mark probably would have read that thing into a pulp.
Probably.
And in some ways, he saved it into your adulthood.
I mean, not for nothing, but I had a copy of Secret Wars 8, which he did not steal, but I read it into a pulp. So, but fortunately you helped me out with that one. So,
yeah, Mark has like this cosmic fate that books return to him, whether it's his cousin giving it back to him or me stumbling upon an extra copy of Secret Wars 8.
Well, look, Dad, if I ever happen upon a second copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, that baby is yours. No,
all right, well,
no pride.
You all heard it. You all heard it here on this episode. Mark could retire, but instead he owed a debt to his buddy Dan Gavassi.
There you go.
So there you go. All right, Mark. Well, there's no better place to end on that sincere promise.
For sure.
So why don't you take us home?
It's that time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this 4th episode of Season 7 of the Amazing Spider Talk. On the next episode of Season 7, we'll be talking about the contributions of superstar artist Todd McFarlane. That's right, we'll discuss the redesign of Spider-Man and the comic by the Todd Father.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, Mark. Obviously, you and I hold Todd McFarlane very close to our hearts as one of the people that really got us hooked on the character in the first place. But until then, this podcast exists because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including our reviews of the latest Amazing Spider-Man comics the same week the comics release, and these seasonal episodes weeks ahead of our public releases, exclusive artwork in the mail, and a ton of other bonuses. Thank you to everyone who already supports us and our work, and a special thank you to our newest patrons, Abraham and Pandre Aorto.
Thank you both. If you value Smart's comics criticism and historical analysis, we hope you'll consider supporting us on Patreon. What we do on the show is admittedly niche. Still, we feel that we offer valuable commentary and model fair methods of criticism for a character and medium that deserves greater consideration and thought than it typically receives. So if these discussions and interviews are valuable to you, we can only continue doing what we do with your support on Patreon.
So, Mark, until I am kidnapped by my real-world analog for Jonathan Caesar and forced to podcast with him, what's our motto?
Ooh, creepy Dan. With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.